Anyway, right now I'm very, very impressed and even touched by everybody here today. Poets have always been holding up a mirror to the world for many centuries, sharing the world the face it chooses not to see. So it is a privilege to introduce this presentation on Irving Layton, Jewish Poems, a discussion on selected Jewish-themed poems by one of Canada's greatest, perhaps most controversial poets, and a leading voice in 20th century Jewish writing. Layton authored more than 40 books of poetry and essays. He is widely considered one of Canada's preeminent poets, was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature, and undeniably provoked and transformed the Canadian literary landscape. Israel Pinchas Lazarovich was born on March 12, 1912, in a small town in Romania. His parents, Moshe and Caina Lazarovich, immigrated to Canada when he was an infant. They lived in Montreal's immigrant Jewish neighborhood east of Saint Laurent Boulevard, which is now demolished, known as the Saint Aubin Street Ghetto. Growing up in multicultural French and English Montreal, Layton struggled not only with poverty, but faced anti-Semitism. This greatly impacted his persona, his writings, his perspectives on politics, racism, identity, social and economic inequalities, and injustices. So, Chevra, we are so fortunate to have with us today Irving Layton's former student, writer, poet, and the editor of Shirim, a Jewish poetry journal, an issue that was devoted to Layton's Jewish poems, Seymour Mayne. Also joining us is Max Layton, Irving Layton's eldest son, and both will unpack and delve into his creative and personal life, as well as read for us the selected poems. I welcome everybody. Bruchim habayim, bienvenue. I'll turn it over now to Seymour.
Thank you, Jenny. And I would like to underline the very unique relationship that Limmud Ottawa, part of the Transnational Limmud Learning Network, and the myriad Jewish Canadian Studies program at the University of Ottawa. We continue to do many programs together. And the myriad program is a unique program. It's the only one of its kind, not only in Canada and the world, focused on the contribution of Jews to Canada, both in every respect, cultural, historical, etc. And we started because of the generosity of Sarah and their late husband, Zev Vered, who made it possible for us to begin this program, which is now in its 15th or 16th year. I didn't check exactly, but around there. So we've been going for quite some time. If anyone's interested, go to our website at the University of Ottawa or just through your regular search engine. And either of our two dedicated coordinators, Natalia and Hernan, can be in correspondence with you if you want to take a course, one of our online courses. You want to be on our list to know about our events. Don't be ashamed. Get on. Don't be modest. Just go ahead and do it. So today we are focusing on Irving Layton's Jewish poems and the actual occasion. And Alexander, can you show the cover of the issue of the magazine? There it is, the cover of Shirim. And a lot of you may not have heard of Shirim. Of course, Shirim in the Hebrew means songs or poems. This is a very modest looking journal that was founded in 1982 by Mark Dworkin. who lives in Los Angeles, worked for many years in the Jewish community and an ordained rabbi. And uh, very early on, I discovered this magazine, I think, in the periodical room of the Givat Ram campus of the Hebrew University, where the Jewish National and University Library used to be together in one place, the humanities and the National Library. I think I went into the periodical room when I was teaching there in the early 1980s, and I saw the small magazine and immediately got a hold of the editor. And then I did in 1983, I did a special Canadian issue introducing Jewish Canadian poets to the audience for Shirim, which were mainly in the United States, UK, and Israel. And it's been going for almost 40 years. And if anyone here is uh, in a very philanthropic mood, I would love to be able to see all the issues of Shirim put into an educational, not a commercial, but educational file somewhere on the internet so that scholars, writers, those interested can look up the many issues. They're not just devoted to Canadian or American or English language poetry. There are issues that touch on the poetry written by Jewish poets in other languages like Spanish, issues dedicated to biblical poetry, biblical responses in contemporary poetry to biblical texts. There's a whole vast range, and I think that Shirin deserves far better, far more wide notice. It's in every major library around the world and university library, but I would like to see it on the net. So if anyone has a philosophical bent, please write me, and maybe we can connect you with the editor and find out a way we can create an educational resource of all the issues of Shirim. Now, Mark, about 2 years ago, approached me. He now brings out, instead of 2 issues a year, one big issue. He wrote me and said, what about doing an issue on Irving Layton? So I said, okay, let me think about it. And I said, great. And then I went about rereading again Irving's work. And I thought, well, it's Shirim, it's a Jewish poetry journal. Let's highlight Irving's Jewish poems. And I think they've been overlooked over the years. As I began to read the large body of his work, I noticed that there was a certain number of poems written in the early phase, that between 1945 to say early 1960s. But then from the late 60s on, there was a profusion of poetry. I'd say half his poems were focused on Jewish subjects. And I think some or other, these have been set aside, have been forgotten. Everybody focuses on his mentor and friend A.M. Klein, but Irving actually wrote a very sizable body of work. So I arranged through the publisher, since this was not going to be a commercial venture, to pick a certain number of poems that would fit a double issue, some 60 odd poems, and present Irving's Jewish poetry or poems on Jewish subjects. Now, it's interesting thing about Irving, as Jenny told you, yes, he came to Canada when he was an infant. He grew up in the immigrant area, which is basically Mile End. The Bullion Street, I think, was the place where his family lived for most of the time, where his mother also had a small grocery shop after her husband died. The irony about Irving's life is, and it's strange, is that actually he never had a Jewish education. When his father died before he had bar mitzvah, he didn't even have a bar mitzvah. He never learned how to read a Jewish language, Yiddish and Hebrew. So what's with this Jewish poem? Well, the point is that from an early age, when he began to work, he was a member of the Jewish community of Montreal. The Montreal Jewish community really had many institutions and many directions in it where people could find their way. He worked at the Jewish orphanage. Then he ended up teaching in the Jewish schools, taught all the way till 1960 in Herzliya High School. He may not have had that bar mitzvah. He may not have learned how to read Hebrew and Yiddish, but he was exposed always to the Jewish environment of Montreal. Must have had enormous number of discussions. And of course, all through that period, he was more of a radical than I would say somebody interested in Jewish things per se. But there was a major change that took place in Irving in 1967. Up to then, he had written a few poems about the Jewish neighborhood of Montreal, the kind of ghetto-like atmosphere of it. the fear of the larger Catholic world all around the Jewish immigrant area. And then came in May and June of 1967, the preamble to, and then the Six-Day War. And for many left-wing Jews who had some or other not really factored Israel into their political vision, very much interested where they were living, United States, Canada, England. They were trying to create, the socialist paradise in their own country, so to speak, I say with a bit of irony. Some or other, Israel was out there on the side. It was not something that was right at the center. And as many of these people of this generation, Irving generation, watched the world stand by while threats were issued by the countries around Israel, predicting that there would be an invasion and the country would be erased off the face of the earth, all of a sudden, a lot of these radicals suddenly found that they had a strong tie to Israel, and their great fear that so soon after the Nazi genocide, that Israel would be faced with a similar kind of experience, and that the country would be overrun by the surrounding countries. And that palpable fear, that concern, I still remember, was even part of the world of non-Jewish poets in Canada. I was, the week of the Six-Day War, I was kind of bunking with one of my mentors, the late poet Earl Burney, and Earl was very, very concerned every day. He would come in the morning and tell me what he had heard. He got up early, telling me what he heard on the news, what was happening in the Middle East. He was terrified that there was going to be a war that would destroy the Jewish state. And yet, of course, we know that through the brilliance of the Israeli military leadership and the choices they made, they reversed, the expectation that was going to happen. But that also created profound effects on many of the older radicals, who found that the young radicals very quickly became very anti-Zionist, while they themselves couldn't understand that because they felt that Jews had the same right as any other people to a country of their own. So what did Irving do? He did an unusual thing. In 1968, on the Canada Council grant, he went to Israel and lived in Tel Aviv for a couple of months and experienced the day-to-day life of Israelis in that city. The unfortunate thing is that he did not contact, he didn't know how to contact, and no one led him to meeting the literary and artistic community in Israel. He lived there for a couple of months and met none of the writers. Israel was enormously an active literary and cultural center at that time, but he didn't meet anybody. He did go up to the Hebrew University at one point, at the Givat Ram, and presented himself one day to the secretary and said, "I'm a poet from Canada, can I give a reading," whatever. And of course, she had never heard of him. I'm sure there were many other writers who came and knocked on their door, and she didn't encourage that he would speak to anybody, including the chair. So he left, and he never met anyone, never gave a reading. And years later, I discussed that with a couple of my friends who are writers and editors in Israel and translators. And they said, how unfortunate, how it would have been wonderful if they had met him and he would join them in their meetings in the various cafes in Tel Aviv. They probably would have translated some of his poetry. He would have gotten the sense of the real intellectual artistic community in Israel. Nonetheless, he did make that commitment and spent a couple of months there and wrote a book. And so I would say, in many ways, engaged the Israeli reality, which stayed with him all the rest of his days. And then, as a result of this experience, I think, and his earlier experience in Montreal, a flood of poems began to come from his pen in the late 60s into the 70s, moving from the situation in Israel, moving towards engaging the whole issue of the Holocaust. And he wrote some memorable poems at that stage. Poems that made a number of people uncomfortable in English Canada because they were not the usual poems about the landscape and about the garrison mentality or other aspects of the geophysical space of Canada. These were dealing with the historical nightmare of the Holocaust. And he didn't stop from doing it. He was on some kind of a mission to write these poems, and I think that was his last phase of major creativity. So I created in this issue a kind of a mini selected poems of Irving's, small number from the earlier period and more poems from the later period. But so at this time, what I want to do is I want to invite Max. And Max and I have known each other since we were, I don't want to go back more than 60 years, Max, when we first met. Max would like to read two poems from the earlier period, that is before the mid-1960s, two poems in which, in many ways, he was a kind of witness to the experience that led his father to write these poems. And he'll read the poems to us, tell us something about it, and I think one or two of the stories I know that he's going to tell us are going to help give us a better picture for those of you who are students of Irving over the years, those of you who knew him, the years he was Mr. Poetry in Canada. There are sides to Irving which I learned from Max, which I hope he'll also share with you. Max. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Hello. Hello, Seymour. Thank you, Seymour. And hello to everyone. I didn't realize I had to unmute myself. Listen, before I do anything, I just want to disagree slightly with something you said in your introduction. You emphasized the fear aspect as bringing out my father's Israeli feelings, but I would also emphasize it was the victory. It was the time of a complete and utter destruction of the Egyptian army, a marvelous conquest, not conquest, but triumph militarily. And I think that changed his perception of the Jew, which I think up until that point, he had not really liked, because it was the Jew of the Holocaust, the Jew of the victim. And I don't think my father wanted anything to do with that. And I think that actually the second poem that I'll read, the not the bull calf, the what?
Cain. The poem
Cain, yeah. I think that there's a part in there we could talk about. But I'd like to start with.
I would like to interrupt you, Max.
Okay.
I'll disagree with your disagreement with me. I didn't say fear was the only element, but the general sense of fear in the Jewish communities, I'm sure he shared it. Something was going. This was a situation as it developed in May and June of 1967. It looked really dangerous.
Definitely.
It didn't mean that that he turned his back for it. He saw it, and then of course the victory, of course, was for him a great affirmation of one of the key things of his poetic vision, that in a world of murderous human beings and dangerous nation states, the Jew and the Jewish people have to make sure they can defend themselves and not find themselves totally defenseless.
Absolutely. No, it was just a matter of emphasis. I wasn't really disagreeing with you, but I think that the fact that Israel triumphed played a very large role in reversing what had been his opinion really earlier. I mean, a lot of my father's life had been spent in revolt, in reaction to the Jewishness, the Judaism of his childhood. You said he didn't have a bar mitzvah. Well, it's more than that. He refused to have a bar mitzvah. And I think that, we have to take into consideration that he did this, although it meant being thrown out of his house at the age of 13. That's a huge choice for a young man to make. He refused to have a bar mitzvah while he was living in the context of the Jewish community of St. Urban Street. And he turns from Judaism to, frankly, socialism, communism, as an international, non-Jewish, not national, international ideology, which had an aspect to it which was religious in effect. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. And so for him to come back to reverence for the Jewish people and the Jewish history, to see it again in a different context, to suddenly see himself as part of a continuum of warrior prophets in the form of Ezekiel, for example, Uh, I mean, that was a change for him. Anyway, I'd like to read, or not read, I'm going to try and recite a poem that I was there when the moment happened. My grandmother, Caina Lazarovich, was in an old folks home on Esplanade Avenue in Montreal, and she had just died. Just must have been moments earlier. We walked into the room. Her, she had not been looked after by any kind of, what they do to people after they die. Nobody had stapled her teeth together so that her jaw would not drop. She was a small, frail woman lying in a bed, her jaw dropped, her mouth open, as he says, a black hole. And it was one of the very few times standing there beside my father that I actually saw him weep. He turned away from me to a window that was there, and I could see his whole body shaking and his shoulders shuddering at the death of his mother. And out of that came this powerful poem. Caina Lazarovich, 1870 to 1959. When I saw my mother's head on the cold pillow, her white water-falling hair in the cheeks' hollows, I thought, quietly circling my grief, of how she had loved God, but cursed extravagantly his creatures. For her final mouth was not water, but a curse, a small black hole, a black rent in the universe, which damned the green earth, stars and trees in its stillness, and the inescapable lousiness of growing old. And I record she was comfortless, vituperative, ignorant, glad, and much else besides. I believe she endlessly praised her black eyebrows, their thick weave, till plagiarizing death leaned down and took them for his mold, and spoiled a dignity I shall not again find, and the fury of her stubborn, limited mind. Now none will shake her amber beads and call God blind, or wear them upon a breast so radiantly. Oh, fierce she was, mean and unaccommodating. But I think now of the toss of her gold earrings, their proud carnal assertion, and her youngest sings, while all the rivers of her red veins move into the sea. It's a very powerful poem. And memorizing it, I noticed a couple of things which, if you've just heard this poem for the first time or only read it casually, maybe you don't notice, but when you're trying to memorize something, you notice things. You have to think about water and circles as part of the meaning of this poem. Her white water falling hair, for example, in the cheeks hollows, and a hollow is like a circle. And her final mouth was not water. And what does that mean, actually? How can a mouth be water? And the only way it makes sense to me is if he's thinking of her, of his mother, as a kind of river, a river of life. And a river has a mouth. Her final mouth was not water, but a curse, a small black hole. There's our circle again, a black rent in the universe. And the whole poem ends with, and all the rivers of her red veins move into the sea. there's the water moving into the sea, which of course is part of the circle of rain. You know, the water of the sea evaporates and comes back down as rain, becomes a river and flows back into the sea. So he's seeing himself as part of a continuum of life created by his mother. And anyway, that's one of the insights I have into that poem.
I have a story to add. When Bill Goodwin, who was your father's nephew, but actually he was the same age because he was the son of Irving's, your father's oldest sister. And they, one year, it must have been 30 years ago, went on a trip together in the summer to Crete. And one late night, they were driving on one of those mountainous roads in Crete, where if you make the wrong move, you will end up in the valley. And I think they had had something to drink. And Irving was driving, which was not exactly a very good idea, because I drove with him once from Toronto to Montreal, and he told me, "You are one of my dear friends. You trusted me all the way." I said, "I didn't trust you. I had no choice. I was in the front with you. Take your hands off the wheel." Anyways, they were driving at night, and he was lurching a bit, and suddenly out of nowhere, he put his foot down on the brake, the way he told it, and he said, "I just saw my mother's face." So he put his foot down the brake, and they got out of the car. And when they got out of the car, they were about an inch from the edge of the road. And they would have gone over the road, and we wouldn't be talking about him the same way today. But it was his mother's vision. He swore his mother showed up in front of him at that moment. And I thought it was a remarkable story. And I think when Bill told me the story about it afterwards, he said he still had the hair creeping up the back of his head, because, you know, another inch or two and they would have been over the cliff. So yes, his mother was there all the time. And some people think that actually his mother was the most important woman in his life, even though he was known to be a man whom many women were close to and a number of them married to. So,
well, there was a very strange love relationship with his mother. I mean, I know for a fact that because he was the youngest son, she cared specially for him. I mean, he told the story. I have no idea whether this is true or not, but he told the story of how he had been born circumcised in Romania, and tzaddiks and rabbis came from all over Eastern Europe to stand by his cradle, because this was the sign of the Messiah, that he had been born circumcised. And there's a piece of my father that believed that his mother believed that and took special care of him for that reason, and would sleep with him in the bed, her warm body beside his, in a slum flat with, you know, probably very, very bad heating. He talks about how there'd be ice on the floor. So, I mean, for him to be thrown out of the house at that age because he refused to say whatever he had to say for the bar mitzvah must have been an incredible shock. And yet I know that she gave him money so he could finish high school. And so did his older sister, Bill Goodwin's mother, Esther. So they knew they had somebody very special on their hands, or there was that feeling anyway. But he was rebellious. But I just want to point out one little thing. There's almost something out of Romeo and Juliet in that line in the poem, till plagiarizing death leaned down and took her eyebrows for his mold. At the very end, in the death scene with Romeo and Juliet, Romeo, looking at what he thinks is Juliet's dead body, says something like, and did death lean down and suck the honey from your lips? It's a very similar thought. And it kind of expresses the love relationship, the profound relationship that he had with his mother, I think.
And she lived with you when you were young, right? In Côte Saint Luc. And yes. I think, was were there any arguments between your father and your mother? Was there any issue that was raised? I think you mentioned once that there was an issue.
Oh
Your
yeah, well,
grandmother.
the whole issue of Judaism was an issue.
Mhm.
Just for openers, my mother and father were both atheists. My mother was Scottish, uh, uh, strong Presbyterian background from Nova Scotia. And my father, of course, strong Jewish background. But both of them were atheists living in a commune in Montreal at the very end of the Second World War. And then my mother got pregnant and they had to find some place for me. And my grandmother, the only reason I'm Jewish is because my grandmother refused to let them move in with her unless my mother converted and I was properly brought up, not brought up as a Jewish boy, but given the sacraments and circumcised properly. And that's what happened. So that was already an issue. And now my grandmother is living in the home with us. And I can remember them sitting at the dining room table and my grandmother arguing with my father that I should be given a Jewish education. And that was a heated subject with my father refusing. And as a result, not only my father doesn't know how to read the liturgy, I don't either, because I was never educated in any of that. He insisted on his son and daughter, my sister Naomi, both of us brought up without any Jewish upbringing at all. So Judaism was a subject, and it was something he was rejecting at that time in his life. Although there is this one occasion that I clearly remember. My father used to always come downstairs every morning. You know, he'd shave and he'd be very loud in his shaving, in his noise. He'd be whistling and singing to himself. And then he'd come down the stairs reciting the words of, what he considered to be his greatest lines at that time, which was, in the midst of my fever, large as Europe's pain, the birds hopping on the blackened wires were instantly electrocuted. And by the time he got to the word electrocuted, he'd have sat down at the table in front of us and look at us with this sort of elfish grin, this impish grin as he's just recited these great lines. And did we, the children, get it? But one morning, it was totally different. He came down, he was absolutely silent, came down, sat at the head of the table with a book in front of him. And it's really the only other time that I can remember him weeping, crying. Just all of a sudden, he buried his head in his hands and started to cry loudly. And my mother and my sister and I jumped from around the table and came and held him by the neck and patted his shoulders and saying, "What's the matter? What happened?" And in front of him, the book had fallen open. He'd actually broken the spine of the book at that page. And it was a page that showed, it was a drawing by an inmate from Auschwitz. And it showed a goose with hanging for Christmas and two Jews hanging beside it. As if the goose was Christ and the two Jews were the two criminals. And he burst into tears over that. Now that I was perhaps 10 at the time, that would make it 1956, which again had been another war, if I recall, between Israel and the Arab neighbors. It was interesting that is when where I know for a fact that his sympathy for Jews and for the Holocaust had actually penetrated him. So his relationship to Judaism and to being Jewish is a very complex thing. It took him a long time to break away from his internationalist, semi-communist ideology. I don't know how much of a communist he was. I know that he was on a blacklist where he could not go into the United States because he was on some sort of, well, blacklist from the State Department in the States. For years, he couldn't go there. We finally went there. He was allowed to finally go to the United States when I was 13, I think I was. So he must have had some pretty strong ties there. He was very radical enough to get on a State Department blacklist. But at the same time, you know, I think he was more of a socialist, really. But it took him a long time. It was a difficult journey for him intellectually to move from that kind of internationalist vision to seeing something worthy in the national aspirations of the Jewish people in the form of Israel. And I think there, we're going back to our original point, it was the victories that changed his mind here. It was a different kind of Jew, not the Jew, the victim of the Holocaust, but the Jew as, well, he talks about it in that poem, her proud, carnal assertion. That's what he likes about his mother. There's something assertive about her. Oh, fierce she was, mean and unaccommodating. That's what he likes about her. And that's what he wants Jews to be like, and how he saw himself.
So how about do you want to recite the poem Cain? It's a
Sure.
long poem.
It's a long poem.
Oh, if you want me to take a break, and I'll read a few poems instead, if you want to take a little break.
Sure, that's a good idea.
You like me to read a few poems?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So we can go up to the first poem. Is a poem from the earlier period when he finds himself in the Church of Notre Dame in Montreal. On seeing the statuettes of Ezekiel and Jeremiah in the Church of Notre Dame. They have given you French names and made you captive, my rugged, troublesome compatriots. Your splendid beards here are epicene, plaster white, and your angers unclothed with Palestinian hills, quite lost in this immense and ugly edifice. You are bored, I see it, sultry prophets with priests and nuns. What coarse jokes must pass between you, and with those morbidly religious, i.e. my prized brother-in-law, ex-Laurentian, pawing his rosary, and his wife sick with many guilts. Believe me, I would gladly take you from this spidery church, its bad melodrama, its musty smell of candle, and set you both free again in no make-believe world of sin and penitence, but the sunlit square opposite, alive at noon with arrogant men. Yet cheer up, Ezekiel, and you too, Jeremiah, who were once cast into a pit. I shall not leave you here incensed, uneasy among alien Catholic saints, but shall bring you from time to time my hot Hebrew heart, as passionate as your own, and stand with you here a while in aching confraternity.
Beautiful poem, fantastic.
And there's another aspect of his poetry, which I included here, is his wonderful wit and humor. And I think that he could be as entertaining as any one of the Jewish comics who appeared in nightclubs and places in the 1950s and 60s. And here's a poem which is not ostensibly Jewish, but so much touched with Jewish wit and humor. I'm being bitten by a dog. A doctor, for mere lucre, performed an unnecessary operation, making my nose nearly as crooked as himself. Another, for a similar reason, almost blinded me. A poet famous for his lyrics of love and renunciation toils at the seduction of my wife. And the humans who would like to kill me are legion. Only once have I been bitten by a dog. And
Going back to the first poem you read, Seymour.
right, yeah,
Well, it's just tying in nicely with what I was trying to say earlier. You notice that it's arrogant men in the opposite square, right? In the sunlight of the opposite square.
right.
They're arrogant. Well, what is it? Oh, fierce she was. No, no, no. And I record that she was comfortless, vituperative, right?
Right,
Ignorant.
but their arrogance is to be, I think, slightly distinguished from what he says about the two prophets. He calls them troublesome compatriots.
Yes.
They're troublesome.
Yes.
It's an aspect he sees of perhaps of himself, of his role in Canadian culture and Canadian literature, not going along with everyone else, standing out and calling out hypocrisy and everything else that a prophet should call out in a society that's given over to materialistic ends and means.
Yes.
So, and of course, Catholicism doesn't come out looking very good in this poem. And it's
No.
interesting because later on he has that poem for my brother Jesus, where he's struggling again with what has happened to what's gone on with the image of the Jew in the Catholic world, and of course in many of the other poems pointing out how the demonization of the Jew in Christian societies for centuries no doubt led towards the preparation for the ideology of the Nazi genocide. So all this starts very early, you're right. And even then in the poem to your grandmother, the poem to walking into the church in Montreal, all these things start early and then they come into fruition later on.
Exactly.
And the point is that, well, someone once said, a poet writes really one poem, maybe small poems, but it's like one work all the way from the beginning to the end. And in many cases, yes, it's true. His poems fit into a larger tapestry, which is all linked by his literary persona, by his themes, by his attitudes.
Well, and also there, I wanted to emphasize, since that's kind of my role here, how personal these issues are for him. His brother-in-law is my mother's brother. That's
Right.
John Sutherland, who was back in 1944 or 43, the founder of, one of Canada's first small magazines. That's the Commune that I'm talking about. My mother was part of it. My father, many other Canadian poets coming out of the Montreal movement are part of this Commune. And to have my uncle John convert to Catholicism and actually take that seriously for my father was an outrage, because my father had rejected all that kind of what he would consider religious hocus pocus. And so again, it becomes very personal. And the gentilization of Jesus becomes a major theme for him, in the same way that he talks about Ezekiel's beard being white, and the whole Palestinian landscape has been destroyed or wiped out, erased. Well, that's the same idea that he has when he's talking about what they've done to his brother Jesus. Maybe you have a poem on that one. Yes,
I'm going to read that next, but I was going to say about John Sutherland really was the major figure there in the 40s, the founding of First Statement Press, and then joining First Statement with the group Preview, which had a older group of poets, including F.R. Scott and P.K. Page and A.M. Klein, and starting a magazine called Northern Review. But somewhere into the mid-late 40s, John Sutherland shifted from, I would say, a kind of a left-wing position to complete about face to a very conservative point of view, aided and abetted by his conversion to Catholicism.
Yeah.
And I think the break between them there in 48 was never healed. John died, unfortunately, in his 30s, I believe, of cancer in Toronto, but I don't think they ever bridged it again. I mean, it is.
Well, it can't have been 48 that it becomes permanent, because my Uncle John was a frequent visitor in our home
48, even then,
throughout the 50s.
really.
Oh, yeah. So, I
Well,
mean,
he died in
I'm
56.
deeply indebted to him for many excellent Christmas gifts, you know.
Ah, okay, good. But he died in 56.
Okay, well, okay, not throughout the 50s, but in the in my childhood, okay, I'm born
Right,
in 1946. So
right. So your
there's a
childhood,
10-year period where I know my Uncle John very well.
okay, so he brought you many good Christmas gifts. All right.
Yes, and is pointedly Christmas gifts.
Yes. Well, that was leading towards what he was going to do.
Yeah.
But still, it is some people. I remember when in the early days, over 50 years ago, when I was basically a juvenile delinquent poet in Montreal, a couple of people took objection to that that comment about John Sutherland because he had done so many good things. Why, make that nasty comment about him? But that was part and parcel of your father's poetics. Those who fell from the movement, those who betrayed the causes, well, he was not going to put up with them and mollify them. And if he
Right.
had to, he was going to call them out.
Yep.
So I want to turn now to the poem for my brother Jesus, which is a key poem of, I think, perhaps the last phase of his creativity. And he was then in his late 60s. He did a couple of books. He made, what was amazing about him, that he made both Jews and Christians in Canada uncomfortable. Christians were uncomfortable because your father wrote a number of poems about the physical aspects of Jesus or his behavior in different ways. And Jews felt uncomfortable because Jesus was always a subject that Jews wanted to stay away from, because in the name of Jesus, so many pogroms and attacks had been perpetrated against Jews for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I remember the controversies in those days and the letters to the editor and whatever, but he managed in that controversy, by publishing this book for my brother Jesus, he managed to kind of poke both Jews and Christians, and really got quite a reaction in Canada from people. And he, of course, he loved it. He loved the controversy. He loved being in the center stage. And of course, his publisher was happy because poetry books usually are not the subject of controversy in most countries, at least not in Canada. And here was Irving with another book that was really the center of a national controversy. But this poem is interesting because he recalls, he thinks of Jesus as a poet in a way, and he grafts the image of Jesus onto his own father and links the two together. Now, there's a few Yiddish words in here. There's the word Meshomit, it means a convert, and Yoshke Pondrik means a little doll, Jesus a doll on the cross. I'm just making sure there's a number of words. I don't think there are any other words here. It was interesting that these Yiddish words, there's the word mamzer, which means bastard. They're in this poem, and I'm sure that they're words that he heard from his own mother when she would be, as he said, loosening her curses and her speech upon her progeny at the grocery store. For my brother Jesus, my father had terrible words for you: whoreson, bastard, meshumad. My mother loosed Yiddish curses on your name and the devil's spawn on their way to church, that scraped the frosted horsebuns from the wintry Montreal street to fling clattering into our passageway. Did you ever hear an angered Jewish woman curse? Never mind the words. At the intonation alone, Jesus, the rusted nails would drop out from your pierced hands and feet and scatter to the four ends of the earth. Luckless man, at least that much you were spared. In my family, you were a mumser, a Yoshke Pondrik, a main reason for their affliction and pain. Even now, I see the contemptuous curl on my gentle father's lips. My mother's never-ending sling-slong curses still ring in my ears more loud than the bells I heard each Sunday morning, their clappers darkening the outside air. Priests and nuns were black blots on the snow, forbidding birds, crows. Up there beside the good old man we invented and the lyring angels. Do you get the picture, my hapless brother? Deserted daily, hourly, by the Philistines you hope to save, and the murdering heathens, your own victimized skin hating and despising you? O crucified poet, your agonized face haunts me as it did when I was a boy. I follow your strange figure through all the crooked passageways of history, the walls reverberating with ironic whisperings and cries, the unending sound of cannon fire and rending groans, the clatter of blood-soaked swords falling on armor and stone, to lose you finally among your excited brethren, haranguing and hallowing them with your words of love, your voice gentle as my father's. So there at the very end, Jesus and Moshe Lazarevich, his father, died when he was young, kind of are grafted together. And the Jesus that he wants to reclaim is not the Jesus in the churches, but the Jesus which would be so much similar to the people of his own community, his own father. As I say, this poem made many people enormously uncomfortable. And especially for a Jewish poet to call Jesus my brother, that made people who are more religious and observant enormously, I said uncomfortable, only because they would just like to push that away. Christianity just didn't have that kind of echo. And I remember myself growing up in literally in the same neighborhoods of Montreal. This was there's great discomfort that all the Catholic institutes and churches around, many of the priests and the nuns who were still in their habits wandering by. It was a world which I know instilled some degree of fear in my own grandmother's experience on Easter Sunday, when there was a parade to St. Michael's Church down St. Urban Street. My grandmother would make sure I was inside with her. She would pull the curtains, close the front door, and stay away from the window because she had experienced pogroms in Russia when she was younger, decades before. She would never let me go out to play on Easter Sunday. No way I was allowed to go out, and always admonished to be very careful about who was going to be around me. So I understand, the depiction here of your grandmother and your grandfather. It's so similar to my own grandmother, though my grandfather didn't seem to care too much. He had been a private in the Tsar's army, and he didn't seem to be afraid of anything. So, but she was.
Well, it's interesting that
yes.
He calls Jesus his brother.
Right.
Because I don't think he means it just in an ethnic sense.
Mm-hmm.
But he also calls him a poet. And there's the brotherhood. I think he sees himself as a warrior poet. And what's interesting about how that poem ends is that there's a kind of a reconciliation with the gentleness of his father, Moshe, my grandfather. Jesus's words are gentle words, but they're also the words of a warrior. I think he saw Jesus as a warrior poet in the same way that he saw Lawrence of Arabia as a warrior poet. In fact, almost any time you talked about anybody, my father would say, well, he's a poet. So he has a very interesting concept of what a poet is. It's not just somebody who spins nice words about landscapes and things like you mentioned. And
the poets were, in his world, on the top of the human heap in a way. They were the type, that were the stereotype, the type that deserves the greatest recognition. Here he comes to terms with his father's gentleness.
Yes.
30 years before, when he wrote the poem on the death of his father, I don't know. When he wrote a poem called Jewish Main Street about St. Lawrence Boulevard, that's not the same kind of gentleness that he would support. But he's older now, your father,
Yes.
and of course, I was thinking just jokingly that if Jesus is his brother, Jesus is your uncle.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking back also to the story you told about the Jewish the Christians walking down the street and pulling the curtains. But you know, my father as a boy, his nickname was Nappy for Napoleon, because the Jewish boys would actually fight battles with the French Canadian boys who would try to invade the Jewish sector. And my father was obviously one of the kind of leaders of that and got the nickname Napoleon, Nappy. And he was very proud of the fact that he'd been a boxer. He'd actually been a boxer. And so his whole mental framework is one of fighting back. And as I've already said, you know, that's one of his objections to the victimology coming out of the Holocaust. The Jew for 2,000 years having been a victim of everybody else instead of fighting back. My father liked the Maccabees, who defeat the Greeks. That's my father's concept of what a Jew should be. He likes the Jews who revolt against the Roman conquest of Israel and you know, killed the entire Roman garrison and ultimately committed suicide at Masada. But they didn't commit suicide in a victim way. They committed suicide in the Roman way, which was, you'll never take one of us as a slave because we will kill ourselves first. And that was something the Romans deeply respected. And probably one of the reasons they kicked them out of Israel, because, hey, you're dealing with a people who actually fights. And then, of course, you get 2,000 years of not fighting. And it's that side of Jewish history that my father didn't really like.
Well, I wouldn't say didn't like, but I would say he began to understand it. So I
Yeah.
want to read one of the Holocaust poems written as a result of a trip he took in 1966 to Germany. It's called Rhine Boat Trip.
Yeah.
It's a lyric. It's written in quatrains, and it reminds you, of course, of the lyrics of the great German Jewish poet Heinrich Heine. I think he must have done that semi-consciously, that this would remind people of Heine's work. Rhine Boat Trip. It's a short, haunting lyric.
Very.
The castles on the Rhine are all haunted by the ghosts of Jewish mothers looking for their ghostly children. And the clusters of grapes in the sloping vineyards are myriads of blinded eyes staring at the blind sun. The tireless Lorelei can never comb from her hair the crimson beards of murdered rabbis. However sweetly she sings, one hears only the low wailing of cattle cars moving slowly across the land.
Fantastic poem.
And then there's a poem to the victims of the Holocaust where, you know, his very strong rhetorical anger comes out. And after that, we can go back to chatting a bit more to the victims of the Holocaust. He read this many times at public readings. So I think I was going to read one or two more, but I think we'll close with this one and then we'll see where we'll go from there. I don't know what the time is. I think we've gone way over the time we thought we were going to discuss and read these poems. To the victims of the Holocaust. Your terrible deaths are forgotten. No one speaks of them anymore. The novelty of tattooed forearms wore off quickly. People now say your deaths are pure invention, a spoof. More corrosive of human pride than Copernicus or Darwin, your martyrdoms must lie entombed in silence. The devil himself is absolved. Polyhistors, naming him the only fascist in Europe, ignorant you were changed into soap and smoke. That's how the wind blows. Tomorrow, some goy will observe you never existed, and the Holocaust your just deserts for starting wars and revolutions. I live among the blind, the deaf, and the dumb. I live among amnesiacs. My murdered kin, let me be your parched and swollen tongue, uttering the maledictions bullets and gas silenced on your lips. Fill my ears with your direst curses. I shall tongue them unappeasable shades till the sun turns black in the sky. That is the poet you're mentioning, the poet who can rise to anger and admonishment, in very strong terms. Poetry which is so rare in the annals of Canadian poetry.
You go back to that word curses. Mm-hmm. My mother's curses,
Yeah.
That influenced his whole poetic persona. He understood himself as being in some way an embodiment of his mother's cursing. Now none will shake her amber beads and call God blind. That word blind over and over. I live among the blind, I think is one of the lines I just saw. Well, do you want me to read the Cain poem before we go?
Yes, you want to read it? Go ahead.
Well, I did a lot of work trying to memorize it,
All right.
I'd hate to leave. Oh, you didn't do the poem. And also, I think it has a profound meaning about Judaism, which I'd like to discuss if we have time. Sure, hope so. Cain.
Let's make sure that Alexandra has it up there on the screen. Cain.
Oh, that'd be helpful. If I forget something, there it is. Oh, good for you.
There it is.
Why didn't we do that for the first poem?
Well, we did that.
Memory lapse.
It was.
Yeah.
It was? Oh. Well, I better not look at it. It'll confuse me. Taking the air rifle from my son's hands, I measured back 5 paces. The Hebrew in me, narcissist, father of children, laid to rest. From there, I took aim and fired. The silent ball hit the frog's back an inch below the head. He jumped at the surprise of it. Suddenly tickled or startled, he must have thought, and leapt from the wet sand into the surrounding brown water. But the ball had done its mischief. His next spring was a miserable flop, the thrust all gone out of his legs. He tried, like Bruce, again, throwing out his sensitive pianist's hands, as a dwarf might or a helpless child. His splash disturbed the quiet pond water, and one old frog behind his weedy moat, blinking, looking self-complacently on. The Lynn's surface at once became closing eyelids and bubbles like notes of music, liquid, luminous, dropping from the page, white bearded. A rapid crescendo of inaudible sounds, and a crone's whispering backstage among the reeds and bulrushes, as for an expiring Lear or Oedipus. But death makes us all look ridiculous. Consider this frog, dog, hog, what you will, sprawling, his absurd corpse rocked by the tides that his last vain spring had set in movement. Like a retired oldster, I couldn't help sneer, living off the last of his insurance. Billows now crumbling, the premiums paid. Absurd! How absurd! I wanted to kill at the mockery of it, kill and kill again. The self-infatuate frog, dog, hog, anything with the stir of life in it. Seeing the dead leaper chaplain-footed, rocked and cradled, in this afternoon of tranquil water, reeds, and blazing sun. The hole in his back clearly visible, and the torn skin, a blob of shadow moving when the quiet pool water moved. O Egypt, marbled Greece, resplendent Rome, did you also finally perish from a small bore in your back you could not scratch? And would your mouths open ghostily, gasping out among the murky reeds, the hidden frogs? We crawl with crushed spines toward the heavens. When the next morning I came the same way, the frog was on his back, one delicate hand on his belly, and his white shirt front spotless. He looked as if he might have been a comic tap dancer apologizing for a fall, or an MC, his wide grin coaxing a laugh from us for an aside or perhaps a joke we didn't quite hear.
So why did he call it Cain?
Yeah, why? Well, we are all the children of the first murderer.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is that murderous instinct, ability in us. But I'm actually more curious about what does he mean when he says the Hebrew in me laid to rest. I think that brings into focus the Jewish meaning here. And what makes it complicated is he says, the Hebrew in me, narcissist, father of children, laid to rest. That's a very strange linking of three things. And I was thinking about that. Okay, father of children. Well, he's doing this. He's killing this frog right in front of me. I'm the son that he took the air rifle from.
Ah, okay.
So, I mean, I was there as he came by, and I was playing with my BB gun, and he really did take it from me and he shot a frog right in front of me. That was a very strange lesson to teach a young boy. What does he mean by narcissist laid to rest? Why does he link the Hebrew in him with the word narcissist? That's an odd conjunction. I think by Hebrew in me laid to rest, he means the Jewish tradition of reverence for life. So l'chaim being, our national toast to life. And that's what got laid to rest. He has no reverence for life at that moment. But what also got laid to rest was his narcissism. He actually had to put aside love in order to pay enough attention to a frog in order to kill it. I think that's the meaning, but I'd be happy to hear what you think.
Well, narcissist also is the way he sees himself as a poet, someone who is concerned with himself. So he puts aside the poet who would be concerned as well with enhancing life, whatever he wants. He puts aside the person who has ethical concerns, the person who would celebrate life in itself. He is turning himself basically into a killer, and it's only a frog, right? But that urge to kill, to destroy, that destructive element in him is the one that he's going to explore in this poem, which he's willing to admit to. But in order to admit to it, he has to put aside that other aspects of himself, which he's expressed in other poems.
Yes,
I see it that way.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how the word self gets repeated in that poem. The self-infatuate frog, dog, hog. Everything is in love with itself. That old frog behind his weedy moat, looking self-complacently on. Everything is concerned about itself. And it's interesting also that he talks about Egypt and Greece and Rome, the three great empires in Jewish history, and doesn't mention Jews, except for the reference to the Hebrew in him at the very beginning. because Jews are the only ones who are still here. The Egyptians aren't. The Greeks of the empire and the Romans of the empire are not here anymore.
Well, Jews were never an empire. I mean, a small little
Exactly.
empire under Solomon. Basically, if you think about it, Jewish history, Hebrew history, in the Bible, always on the border with the greater imperial cultures. And
Yes.
Jews are always. It's strange. The Jews go down to Egypt, the great imperial culture of its time. Jews are always going towards those cultures, and they're the edge of it. It doesn't mean that they want to do the same thing as these imperial cultures are doing.
Well, exactly. So it's a big thing to lay aside the Hebrew in him, which is the history of not trying to be an empire like the Romans and the Egyptians, and actually resort to the same kind of killing, the purposeless killing of the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks. I think that's part of the meaning of this poem. But here's a little question. Who do you think the frog is? Or what do you think the frog is? What does the frog, maybe nothing, maybe it's just a frog. But I suspect that the frog is a little more than that in my father's mind. Is the frog all innocence? Is it the Jewish people itself?
No, I don't think the Jewish people, but I think it's in his poems, in many of his poems, you find mammals, small forms of life.
Yeah.
And he sometimes, it seems to me, if you went through his poems, if we did today, instead of saying Irving Layton, the Jewish poems, Irving Layton's the animal poem, say, or the
Absolutely.
ecological, we find that he has more love and sympathy and bonding and empathy with snakes, frogs, cats. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head.
The white mouse.
Yeah.
The white mouse.
Mice. These are the ones that draw him. In a way, it's a bit of a misanthropic way of orienting oneself, but he feels closer to them and less close to human beings. And
Well,
maybe
human
part
beings
of
are
it,
the descendants of Cain.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Cain, and perhaps I'm psychologizing his early experience, leaving home at 13, finding his way, the famous breakdown he had in his 20s, his reorientation in his life. He was suspicious of, it's funny because in his poems, he speaks of a great suspicion of others, of human beings, of their need to destroy and to kill. And yet, if you got to know him, I did, not as a son, but as a friend in a way, and as a former student, you found that actually he could be enormously generous and open. I don't know what he was like with his children, but sometimes I felt that he sometimes put more attention to his former students and to younger writers than he did to his own children. That's what sometimes it seemed to me. But he was generous and open, and that sometimes used to really it would not upset people, but it would. I remember many writers would say to me, Irving Layton, you read his poems, you expect that you're going to have somebody who's going to be loud and aggressive and pushy. When you meet him, he's actually most of the time a reasonable, gentle soul. But then again, I didn't live with him, and I don't know how many times he yelled at you, so I can't tell. I can't tell.
I don't want to disturb this amazing discussion going on here, but I know that we have a lot of questions coming from our audience, and we also have some questions in our chat.